Okay, so maybe you're new to photography or you just got a new camera recently and you're interested in making the move to manual mode, but you're not quite there yet. I mean, you understand the concept of aperture and shutter speed and ISO, but you're just not confident enough to use it in the big moment. And so you wind up reverting back to auto mode. And then you wind up getting a photo like this, when you were really trying for this, or this, when you wanted this. And has this ever happened to you?
That's one small step for man.
Well, I've got a bit of a secret that a lot of the pros use and they don't talk much about. And not only is it going to help you in the big moment, but it's also going to help you get more comfortable with manual mode quickly. It's called Aperture Priority, and I'm going to show you how to use it today. Okay, before we start, another sincere thank you to all you new subscribers. I'm super excited about the community we're building, and I'm looking forward to hanging out together here. And if you haven't subscribed already, we do simple to understand photography and video tutorials, insights, and reviews. So hit that subscribe button, you won't be sorry. So at this point, you probably understand the basics of manual mode and the exposure triangle and how aperture and shutter speed and ISO work together. But still, using all three of those levers in a changing environment on the fly and trying to nail shots is not easy. And that's where Aperture Priority comes in. And your first question might be, well, how's Aperture Priority different than full auto or program mode? Well, program mode is where you set the ISO and the camera decides the shutter speed and aperture for you. Aperture Priority is where you set the aperture and then the camera decides the ISO and shutter speed for you. But this can even be dialed in a little bit tighter, and I'm going to show you how. And your second question might be, okay, then what situation is Aperture Priority good for? And the answer is pretty easy. Unless you need to control your shutter speed for, say, sports or freezing action, or maybe when you want to slow down action, like in a waterfall or a river, and you want to smooth out that water, or say night photography where you need to keep your shutter open to capture the Milky Way, well, then you're probably going to want to use Shutter Priority. But pretty much everything else can be covered by Aperture Priority. Portraits, fashion, weddings, events, landscapes, cityscapes, and even street photography, you can use Aperture Priority with confidence. Let me tell you how I use Aperture Priority and how I make sure that I have complete control over my settings no matter what the situation is. And at the end, I'll give you some tips to dial your exposure to even be more precise and get exactly what you see with your own eyes. So your first step's pretty easy. You're going to want to set it in Aperture Priority, and that's denoted by an A on Sony cameras and I believe on Nikon cameras and an AV in Canon and some other cameras. Just take a quick peek at your manual and you'll know exactly which letter to dial it to. Second, if I'm doing landscapes or cityscapes or anything where my camera's on a tripod, then I choose my aperture, typically f8 or f11, as this is a deep enough depth of field to get everything in focus and usually the sweet spot for sharpness on lenses. The next thing I do is I set my ISO to 100, which is the base ISO for the Sony a7 cameras. As for landscapes, it's ultra important to get the cleanest shot possible. Okay, so the next step is I just frame my shot, set my focus, and take the photo. See, the camera decides what the shutter speed is going to be depending on the light that's coming in, and since my camera's on a tripod, I don't really care what it is. I know it's going to be stable and I'm going to have a sharp photo. And that's basically it. It's pretty simple. In fact, let's go outside and frame up a shot and I'll show you exactly how to do this and what I'm talking about.
Okay, so we're all set up. We've got our camera on our tripod and our landscape-ish scene, and not the most beautiful in the world, but it'll do for today. And so our first step is to put the camera in Aperture Priority, which we've done, denoted by the A. And then our next step is to set the ISO to 100, and we've done that. We know we want to be in f11 because we're doing a landscape, and if we want to, we can go down to f9 or f8, but I like f11 if it's possible. And the camera's chosen a 1/4 second speed. And you can see here that these lines are the zebras that are indicating that we may have a blowout in our highlights here. So in order to check that, we turn on our histogram and we'll just see, make sure that it's not pushed so far right that it's off the edge of the graph here. Now the histogram is just showing us the darkest pixels on the left and the brightest pixels on the right in the image. So you can see here that most of this image is dark, and we've got some highlights down here, but you can see that a lot of this is in the dark range or darker middle range, and that's denoted by the pixels right here. And I'll be doing a whole video on histograms pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. That's going to be a good one. Okay, so the other things that you might want to check are your white balance, and make sure that the scene is being rendered in the same kind of color that you're seeing in front of you. I would suggest, if you're a beginner, just leave your white balance on auto for now, as the cameras are pretty good at detecting what the white balance should be. As you get more experience, you're going to want to dial in your white balance yourself, because you may be doing composites or stacking images and you don't want that white balance to change, and you really want to dial that in as closely as you can before you get back to your computer to start processing. It makes it much easier when you're processing your image if you've already got that dialed in properly in camera. So now we have our composition set, and all we want to do is make sure that it looks good on the histogram. And so as long as the histogram looks good, which it doesn't look like we have any blown out pixels, we just have a warning. And you can see here we've got our little box that shows the focus point. So we dial that in right to the spot where we want it focused, and we make sure that's focused properly, and we take a shot, and then we just check the shot, make sure that it looks good, make sure that the focus is on, and that, which it looks like it is. And we check the histogram, make sure that there's no blowouts on the highlights, and that looks pretty good. And that's it. It's as easy as that. Now, if we did have blowouts and highlights, what we can do, and here's a little trick, is you can use your compensation dial. This is your exposure compensation, and you can adjust this aperture priority just a little bit to your liking. So if we felt it was a little bit blown out, we would just dial this down, and each click is 1/3 of a stop. And so if we dial it down 3 stops, that's 1 full stop of light. And you can see that it's showing here exposure compensation is -1, and now we're at 1/6 of a second. If we do it more, -2, we're now at 1/13 of a second, and -3, 1/25 of a second. You can see the image getting darker as we do that. So if you're really concerned about blowouts, you can adjust that way. So we'll dial it down 1, and we'll take a photo and see what it looks like. And if you look at your histogram, it's actually exposed a little bit to the left for my liking, and I would rather that be exposed to the right. Remember that these are JPEG renderings, and so that histogram is going to be off the JPEG, not off the RAW file, which the RAW file will have a much, much larger dynamic range than the JPEG file. So you can push it a little bit further to the right and be sure that you're getting all of these details in the shadows, and eliminate noise if you're trying to raise those shadows and make them brighter in post-processing. So I would rather expose to the right and make sure that I've got those darks exposed properly. Okay, so now your question might be, that's great for landscapes, but what about portraits? How can I use this for portraits? And that's easy. Like we were talking about before, you want to set your minimum shutter speed, which is right here, to 1/125th, and then you want to make sure that your ISO is on auto. So we've got auto, ISO, with a minimum shutter speed of 1/125th. And that should eliminate all your camera shake if you're doing handheld. So let me put you down as we take this off the tripod. So now if we drop our f-stop to, say, f4, which is more appropriate for portraits, and you'll see your shutter speed change as we move around and direct it towards the sunlight. But you'll also see that when you go to take your photo, that ISO is going to change as well. So you see the ISO is now 125. Whereas if we move down here, your ISO is now 1000 because the image is dark enough that the amplification on your camera sensor needs to be higher, so that ISO goes higher. And as we move into real dark areas, you'll notice that that ISO will really move up to compensate for that shutter speed. So if you're at a party in a dark room, or if you're at a graduation in a dark hall, that ISO is going to compensate for your 1/125th shutter speed. And that's it. That's how it works. Okay, we're back in the...
Okay, we're back in the studio, a little bit of a recap here. So the first thing you're gonna wanna do is make sure your camera's set up properly before you go on your shoot. And you can just tick through a few simple steps to make sure you do that. First, make sure your camera's dial is set to aperture priority and choose your aperture. If you're doing landscapes, it's gonna be f8 or f11. If you're doing portraits or events, it's gonna probably be 2.8 or 4.0. Next, choose your ISO. If you're gonna do landscapes, you know you're gonna be on a tripod, and so your ISO can be 100. If you're gonna be doing portraits or events, then you know you're gonna wanna use auto ISO with a minimum shutter speed of 160. Third, turn on your zebras to make sure you don't blow out your highlights. Then just choose your composition and use your compensation dial to be sure that you're exposed properly. For landscapes, you're going to want to expose to the right, and for portraits and events, just be sure that you're exposed to what your eye sees. Then just take your photo, check your sharpness in your histogram, and adjust if you need to, and that's it. To make it super easy for you, I made a PDF that you can download and put on your phone to refer to no matter where you are. I'll leave a link in the description below and you can download one for yourself. So tell me, what stage of photography are you in, and have you struggled with manual mode? I know I sure did when I first started out, and I still use aperture priority in certain situations. It's super helpful. Leave a comment below and let me know. Also, if you want to know more about ISO, I recently did a video about native ISO that explains everything you need to and want to know about ISO, no matter what camera you're on. I'll leave a link in the description below and you can check that out. I hope that this video helps, and if you feel like it did, please hit that like button, as that really does help. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and that little notification bell to stay in the loop around here, and I'll see you in the next video.